welcome everyone. We're just going to get started in a few minutes here with our the latest episode of Conspiracies and Counter Games, the Rival 2021 Summer Institute, with our guest Jack Bratich. But we'll wait for some more people to join us here in the Zoom room before we do and get started a couple minutes past the hour. We are, just for those who are in the Zoom room, we are broadcasting now and also recording. So, prepare yourselves accordingly. We'll get started here in just a minute. We'll just start with a little preamble before we get to our guests. So my name is Max Haven, and I'm here at the Reimagining Value Action Lab, which is a workshop for the radical imagination, social justice, and decolonization here at Lakehead University on the north shore of Gichigami, or Lake Superior. This is our second Summer Institute. Usually we do a Summer Institute each year in person, often here in the area of Thunder Bay, where we bring together students with artists, activists, and researchers to discuss pertinent topics. For obvious reasons having to do with the global pandemic, we are online this year, and our topic connects to a research project I'm working on with Aris Komporozos-Athanasiou and A.T. King-Smith on conspiracy games and counter games. And we're exploring the intersection of conspiracy fantasies and the dangers they pose in a gamified capitalist world. That is a world where we all feel we're trapped in a game that we have very little control over. And the way that then gives rise to all sorts of ideological fantasies, but also forms of resistance and possibility as well. We've been joined in the Institute so far by my colleagues and I in our first session by Brian from the TISA Collective, which is a social justice-oriented board game company, or cooperative, I should say, from the United States. We've been joined earlier this week by Elle Jones, poet, activist, and scholar, speaking about Black liberation and white fear. And today we're joined by Jack Bratich from Rutgers University, whom I'll introduce you to in a second. On Monday, we're joined by novelist, essayist, and podcaster Hari Kunzru, author most recently of the excellent and quite significant novel Red Pill, which speaks about some of the themes of paranoia, patriarchy, and the rise of the far right that we are concerned with as well. And then a week from today, on Thursday, August 8th, we'll be joined by artist, activist Cassie Thornton, who will be speaking about the project that she is overseeing called The Hologram, and also a number of people who are registered in this Summer Institute are also involved in that very exciting peer-to-peer feminist health conspiracy. So, we are here today. We're very fortunate to be joined by Jack Bratich. Jack is a professor of journalism and media studies at the Rutgers School of Communication and Information in New Jersey. He's focused for many years on the intersection of political culture and popular culture, including doing excellent and really insightful work on conspiracy panics, on surveillance, on journalism, on activism, and on the ways in which the truth is produced by social institutions. He's the author of a number of different articles and books, including from 2008, Conspiracy Panics, Political Rationality and Popular Culture, and co-editor of Foucault, Cultural Studies and Governmentality, as well as a couple of articles that we're going to focus on today. Jack, thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks, Max. Happy to be here and look forward to the conversation.
So just a reminder to those who are in the Zoom room that if you want to pose questions to Jack, you can post them in the chat and I will be happy to pass them on, or you can raise your hand using the hand raising function of Zoom and I can help you unmute yourself and join us in a more intimate appearance, or vocal appearance, perhaps. All right. Jack, I wanted to start off by asking you to go back to your sort of 2008 book, Conspiracy Panics, Political Rationality and Popular Culture, where you offered what I always found to be a number of really important insights. And one of them was that, all of the concern over conspiracy theories can often itself be a kind of what you characterize as a kind of conspiracy panic, and that those who are sometimes loudest in sounding the alarm about the threat of conspiracy panics have a kind of vested interest in making us believe that the real problems with our society, with truth, with journalism, with beliefs, is a handful of often very marginalized people believing something that's wrong or incorrect, whereas in fact the bigger problems we have to deal with have to do with the way the power is organized in our society and inequalities. I wondered if you could kind of go over that a little bit in light of what's happened over the last 13 or so years, and where we find ourselves today in 2021, in an era when many more people than ever are concerned about conspiracy fantasies, and also in the thrall of them in some ways too.
Yeah, thanks for that great introduction and opening question, Max. I would say, like, it's one of these projects that I have been working on for so long, and I keep trying to get away from it in some ways and write about other things and some of the things you've noted, and then it just, the world pulls me back in, right? History determines what I get to focus on, but I will say, yeah. So even though it came out in 2008, actually I'd been working on that as a doctoral student in my doctoral program throughout the 90s, much of the 90s. So it's a very kind of, situated book in that sense, situated research from that era. And then there's a chapter on 9/11. So there was a 21st century dimension to it too. But so many of the examples were there. And the thing that really kind of drew me to this is that I was seeing two things happen simultaneously in the 90s. One was the rise of in pop culture, the kind of films, or not so many games, but there's some games perhaps, TV shows like The X-Files, films like JFK, Conspiracy Theory, a whole slew of pop culture representations and narratives that are related to conspiracies and conspiracy theories. And on the other hand, at the same time, news accounts that were growing increasingly concerned about the rise of what they called conspiracy theories, and often that was tied to political action too. Often right-wing movements, what they called anti-government movements, which is an interesting word we can talk about at some point, right? That somehow being anti-government is inherently right-wing, and it's tied to things like militias and the Oklahoma City bombing. So I was seeing these two simultaneous things happen, and occasionally those things would overlap. In the case of something like Oliver Stone's film JFK, which was both a Hollywood production and got a lot of backlash by historians and reporters who basically said, hey, you're stepping on our turf. We're the ones who get to determine the truth of that narrative. So how dare you, Hollywood director, try to do that? So as someone, working within cultural studies and media studies, this was sort of my interest in it. And during this time, you also started to see some scholarship come out that focused on why people believe. And so this was kind of the main question, both in terms of popular discourse and academic discourse. And I didn't want to just ask that question because, like you said, that might not be the most interesting political moment that was happening, or the political development around this was not why do people believe strange things, but what is it about our narratives of how power works, and who gets to produce truth claims around how power works. Those things to me were more interesting, and so it became a way to see this period of mostly the 90s as what I thought was I was seeing something around the management of dissent through this idea that something called conspiracy theories were a form of dangerous knowledge that could lead to dangerous action. So at the time, you mentioned the Foucault and Cultural Studies and Governmentality book. So a few of us were working within Foucault's governmentality literature. And so a number of us were looking at how the 90s saw in the Anglo-American context a transformation of governance around, or I should say, the kind of democratic, liberal, centrist moment where Blairite Labour in the UK, in the US, the kind of Clinton era stuff, right? So, and in that moment, we were seeing something like how, you know, rationality was, in this case of conspiracy theories, rationality was being put forth as a kind of way to talk about how to manage more effectively, and to still allow people to have freedom, but freedom within reason, freedom within boundaries. And so this to me was, you know, I won't go too far into the way the book goes into the history of liberal skepticism and how conspiracy theories might be a form, an exaggerated form of that. I'll just leave that to the side. But politically speaking, what I was trying to get at was how a kind of centrism was emerging around this idea of political rationality. And it was even kind of, you know, how should I say, like kind of connecting to or luring in progressives and leftists who also got on board with this idea that conspiracy theories were inherently right-wing, were inherently dangerous, and needed to be stopped, right? Not knowing that leftists were also then getting positioned as conspiracy theories. But okay, so that's the kind of, you know, not the summary of the book, but the way the book was written. And I chose fairly political conspiracies, meaning in the sense of ones that had something at stake, I would say, about what it means to think about power, especially in the US. And that was the JFK assassination, 9/11, the CIA crack cocaine connection that came out in news stories. And then alongside of this, the kind of genocide and bioweaponry narratives against marginalized communities that were, one was a CIA crack version, but the other one was AIDS as genocidal biowarfare. So these were, to me, also had some built-in political stakes to them, and wasn't going with certain just kind of outlandish ones about aliens or something like that, even though that has politics built into. Anyway, so, and again, being from media studies, I focused on the mediation of a lot of these. Okay, so this happens, and so, you know, I think your second part of your question is like, well, what has changed in 13 years? Well, a lot. For one thing, I wrote it, right, it came out in 2008, and this is where I would say the cusp of sort of, you know, what was then called Web 2.0, or now, you know, social media platforms really started burgeoning, right, in that moment. So the book is written, I have mentions of things like the 9/11 truth movement and its use of like websites, and I talk about the internet in the 90s, but, you know, but the way that social media has also already become this kind of core object that when people talk about misinformation or conspiracy theories, now it's linked to social media. So that's new. But I also think there's something even like more, something deeper about the political state of things that has changed. And that's what I would say also 2008, around a certain kind of crisis in governance and a crisis in the state. That what I was examining throughout the 90s and in the 2000s to some degree in the Bush era was a kind of consolidation and integration of governing powers, and through this idea of political rationality. But that what we see, certainly with 9/11 and a kind of turn in the US to a security state or a war context, war on terror context, and then a crisis in governance after the financial meltdowns of 2008, I would say that we have a different kind of context for this too, so, you know, and some of that crisis is also a crisis in trust in certain kinds of institutions that are authorized to tell the truth. That includes professional journalism and politicians, scientists. All of these things were in play before, and I think it's really come to the foreground, though, in the last 5 to 7 years, and really kind of, you know, zoomed up with things like QAnon and the pandemic. But I'll sort of pause there because I've said a lot.
Yeah, and it perfectly dovetails into what I wanted to ask you next, which is about this article that you published quite recently, Civil Society Must Be Defended, Misinformation, Moral Panics, and Wars of Restoration, where you essentially argue, and correct me if I get this wrong, that in a funny way, in this moment when all of these truth-telling institutions are in a legitimation crisis, they once again find a way to reinforce one another's claims to legitimacy by creating this kind of moral panic about misinformation and fake news, and this war that gets sort of fomented, where governments, media institutions, non-governmental organizations, even the university gets all kind of conscript themselves into taking on this menace. which then, of course, overshadows many of the other menaces that face us in this moment. And yeah, I wondered if you could sort of speak a little bit about how you see that forming, that kind of that strange alliance. I mean, in the article, you mentioned a bit about how even the social media companies like Facebook and Google that were once the kind of conceived of themselves as the enemies of the legacy media. In fact, they destroyed the market shares of much of the legacy media, now find themselves on the same side as their one-time opponents.
Yeah. So it was, and this is one of those, again, cases where, for years I started just writing about other things like social movements and crafting and then yeah, around 2015 I started seeing just the word conspiracy theory come up again, but now in a context where the crisis was over this idea of post-truth, that we have entered a post-truth era. And so conspiracy theories were part of this string of terms, fake news, misinformation, that then were symptoms and examples of this kind of crisis around, what I would consider the crisis of trust and authority, but that was called post-truth, right? So what I was tracking in that article then is how, a kind of reshuffling of some of these actors took place. And so I draw this whole idea of moral panics and conspiracy panics from trained in cultural studies from the Birmingham School, Stuart Hall, et al., the Policing the Crisis collection, which came out in the late 70s about the construction of mugging as in the UK as a kind of panic that actually displayed fears around race, but was coded through criminal language, but then all the ways that the very definitions of mugging and the language used was being sort of defined by the police and by politicians, and then the journalists were the ones who sort of like just kind of conveyed that to the public, that language that was set up by the state. But what I saw happening since 2015, 2016 was a kind of reshuffling of this, where no longer were journalists sort of secondary. They became primary definers of what post-truth, what misinformation, what conspiracy theories were, and then worked hand in hand in some ways with, especially in the U.S., with state agencies, specifically intelligence agencies, also court hearings, congressional hearings, to kind of berate social media platforms and kind of shame them into doing better when it came to how they defined misinformation and fake news. And so, we still see that today. It's like continues this kind of constant berating of the social. And I'm not trying to defend the social media platforms, but I'm just saying that was the kind of moralizing form that got them on board to become part of this greater nexus, is what I call it now, a nexus or an apparatus around misinformation. So I was kind of tracing just some of these actors and then the funding that goes into NGOs, and there's a massive one at my own university at Rutgers University that studies network contagions, and so I'm not part of it. I don't think they'd ever have me to be part of it, but they're in some zone inside my university that's a well-funded space. But this idea that now, academic institutions are being recruited into this as a kind of complex to make sense of dissent. And why I think this is important is so it's not that I'm a relativist. You don't have to be a relativist. I'm not saying you can't denounce narratives about the world that you think are too conspiratorial. But the question I want to ask is almost like, to what end does using a term like that, to what end does that serve? Like, how both consistent is the concept of conspiracy theory, but more often, like, what is the force that wields it and weaponizes it? And I just think basically it's actually an inconsistent term because it can be applied to many different things. But so I just think it says more about the person or actor or force that utters it than it does about the target of it. That's the kind of claim, one of the claims of the book. I still think that holds. And so it functions as a folk devil in the kind of Stanley Cohen sense, in the ways that moral panics work. Anyway, that it means many people believe in it, but there's no agreement about what it means, but it can activate all kinds of things. And I think that's the things that we have to think about. What is it activating? Those devils might be harmful, but the devil hunters themselves might be harmful too. So that's the kind of, I think that's where we are with the kind of misinformation, fake news part of things.
And I mean, one of the things you mentioned in that article, and we've been looking at in this institute and the class around which the institute is built, is that like often the actors who claim to be saving us from fake news and conspiracy theories are themselves, not exactly innocent. And we've talked about the way that the media and the sort of political establishment in both the UK and the US were totally complicit in essentially concocting fake news to justify the invasion of Iraq. We have a long history of the United States using its security apparatus to attack activists, notably the COINTELPRO program, which led to targeted assassinations and horrific disruption of Black liberation, Puerto Rican, and other liberation movements. We have the revelations from Edward Snowden and the revelations just last week that came out about just the depth and breadth of the spying that goes on in surveillance systems that go on and the secrecy with which those are handled. So there's a way that the folk devil of the conspiracy theory then, is almost like a sleight of hand or misdirection, where we don't actually look at what institutions actually have significant provable forms of power in our society that are, and these are the same forces that are often telling us that the biggest problem is, fake news and conspiracy theories.
Exactly, and in addition to we how do I say this? We have those facts that people have done that research. It's also the platforms. Like, where are the platforms where this can circulate? And it happens to be the very places now that also get sort of demonized as the places of fake news and misinformation. So that so it becomes this thing that there's a way that there's a boomerang effect also for people who actually also have an investment in a kind of critical history of either covert operations of the state or fairly overt operations of the state, whether it's imperialistic Cold War moments or domestic kind of spying too. So it's a very, very much a distraction.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. I like in that article too that you draw on the warlike and qualities of this war on fake news, and the way that in fact a number of the people who are at sort of the leading edge of it are people who trained in counterinsurgency, psychological operations. They really see it as a war, and you frame this as us being caught in some ways between two ongoing wars of restoration, which I think is a really useful concept. On the one hand, we have a kind of war. So as these social institutions lose their legitimacy in the face of kind of the collapse of society, of a market-driven society, and things are getting worse for most people. The poor are working people are getting poorer, the rich are getting richer. Social society is breaking down in many ways thanks to its disemboweling by market forces. You have on the one hand this war of restoration with which I think we're all familiar and very concerned, which is the kind of far right reactionary restoration of, heralded under the banner of Make America Great Again, which presumes that, over the last, I don't know how long they would say it is, but certainly over the last 40 years, sort of racialized groups, women, queer people, special interest groups have gotten too much power and have now sabotaged America and other countries as well, through their kind of nefarious demands. And so there's this right-wing war of restoration to try and restore America and other places to what is imagined to be their sort of fabled origins around religion and family and race. But then you point out too that there's a second war of restoration going on as well, and that's the restoration of this kind of centrism that you spoke about before, the kind of neoliberal, what would present itself as the mainstream, which is really, again, just about entrenching corporate power and limiting the scope of what society is capable of doing and opening up society to the market. But now pointing the finger at the far right war of restoration justifies itself and says, you need us, we need to go back to, I don't know when, the Clinton era, at some point when neoliberalism allegedly worked. I wondered if you could sort of spell that out for us. And then is there another choice? I mean, are we destined to simply choose between far right war of restoration or centrist war of restoration?
I know, I know, I know. Yeah. So, yeah. I mean, you summarized it so well. I'll take a step back and say, like, yeah, that war has been like sort of not just on my mind, but it's been infusing my work, not just on this topic, but others for some time. But within this topic, so I did notice that, like, yeah, part of that kind of crisis that I mentioned in the 21st century, that when the U.S. really kind of reshapes the state to think about, security, to think about a war on terror, then war becomes the overriding framework. That various kinds of wars. I think so. At one point, I opened some talks. I'm like, we're the convergence of all the wars right now. All the wars that are coming back: colonial wars, the U.S. Civil War, the Cold War, right? The war on women, right? I mean, it's almost like we're at a moment where all the wars have appeared, and we have to kind of sort them out. Not just sort out the terrain, but actually like which war is happening at any given moment, and how are we positioning ourselves within that. But within this topic, yeah. So, I began to see the language of information warfare being used to say how we're going to combat conspiracy theories. And that was like Cass Sunstein's work, who later became, Obama's information czar, wrote this piece on like what he called cognitive infiltration, where you go into communities and you just disable their ability to think and to promote their ideas. And so very much that kind of classic war information warfare set of operations being promoted as just like, yeah, this should be the way we combat misinformation and conspiracy theories. So even within that, it was very specific that way. But this is where also different kind of research streams of mine converge, because I'd been working a little bit. I wrote a piece for Fifth Estate, the anarchist magazine newsletter, not newsletter, but magazine, and on the alt-right and their kind of play with reality and the cosplay, what I thought was cosplay at a number of the kind of protests, and how I was developing there this idea of the war of restoration, because they were kind of dressing up obviously as soldiers, as centurions, right? This kind of like fantasy world, but in cosplay form during their protests. And as you mentioned, you articulate quite well, kind of the right wing, especially white nationalist and patriarchal kind of war of restoration of this mythic past, that in which all these kind of privileged positions of power were intact, that kind of fantasy of that. So I'm writing that, and then meanwhile I'm also then seeing, yeah, exactly as you put it, like elements of the kind of the state also kind of talking about this, and defining it as the enemy. And we obviously see that really lately when it comes to the January 6th storming, and how some of the best images and the best language for it in some ways are coming from this very kind of centrist kind of nexus of state agents along with journalists who are sounding the alarm and doing some research into this stuff. Anyway, so okay, but what I'll say about that is like, so the war of restoration there to me is like, yeah, a kind of the restoring this idea of the public, of a kind of consensus-based liberalism that I would say, they're almost their favorite moment probably is like the late 50s, early 60s, that moment of a kind of consensus liberalism and an intellectual world that could seemingly shape public opinion, and they still had an enemy, which was at that point the Soviet Union, right? And so I think that comes into play with a lot of the kind of Russiagate stuff that was happening, also during the Trump era, was this kind of revival of that Cold War era consensus liberalism as the kind of construction of the centrist position. And now why I call it centrist too is because, and this is where I think, to go back to your question, what other kinds of approaches, is what I think is happening, right? Whenever I hear the word extremism, I think we ought to be a little, reluctant and just a little hesitant to sort of buy into it, because that's a position in the center that says both sides, right? There's a spectrum, the center, that both sides have problems and potential dangers. And so for me, thinking about different ways of being, anti-capitalist and anti-state, anarchist and feminist, it means thinking about the dangers of something called extremism being applied as it already is to people on the left, as well as anarchists and other forms of abolitionists. So what I draw inspiration from, around this is, at the very least analytically, is the idea that's been put forth by people on the Political Research Association. Is that right? Chip Berlet, Matthew Lyons. The idea of the three-way fight, right? And you see that in a book like Life Under Warfare, edited by Christian Williams and others, right? This idea of we need to have ways to combat both the state as well as fascist social movements and reactionary social movements, and not let the state determine how that gets done, because otherwise we will also get swept in with that. I mean, it's just kind of I think it's kind of obvious that that's going to happen. So that's how I would say that the kind of the war framework is really kind of all consuming to me in some ways, but it becomes like, which war do you not just say like, I don't want to fight any wars, because the war will come to you in some ways, right? So it's a question of how you want to position yourself. And you don't have to be a combatant necessarily. I'm just saying, but there's a number of wars already happening. So how do you position?
I want to link what you were just saying to a couple of our former guests on the Institute show here. Just on Monday, we were speaking with Elle Jones, who said something very similar about, she's a longtime abolitionist organizer here in Canada, and writing about international issues as well, and pointed out that, as an abolitionist, she can't condone the ways in which the state apparatus is seeking to criminalize even forms of sort of right-wing dissent, which she, obviously strongly disagrees with and is personally targeted by, and doesn't trust the prison or police system to actually address those. And we need to look for other solutions that don't just give more power and authority to governments to repress dissent, because if they're used on the right, then they'll be used often much more violently and effectively on the left. Often because, and she doesn't mention this, there are close ties between the far right and law enforcement and security agencies, certainly in the United States and Canada and elsewhere as well. And then I wanted to tie it back, what you were talking about, this kind of strange cosplay-like quality to something that my colleagues and I were talking about in our first week together. We're interested in conspiracy fantasies as a kind of dangerous play that emerge in some ways from a very alienated society, where it feels like we're all trapped in a game we can't win. And then it gives rise to all of these ways of trying to play within and against that system. But many of those ways of playing are extremely dangerous and destructive. And this maybe segues into the next question I want to ask you, which is to turn to another article that you wrote with Sarah Bennett Weiser. And in that article, you really focus on the patriarchal and sexist and anti-feminist dimensions of a lot of these sort of conspiratorial or far-right movements that are occurring. And you focus there on two specifically. On the one hand, the kind of industry, a kind of entrepreneurial industry that's grown up around so-called pickup artists, who are essentially like very sexist men who promise that their followers, that they'll teach them how to basically use a kind of psychological warfare in order to convince women to have sex with them, which often bleeds very quickly into forms of sexual assault and abuse. And then you also in that article talk about the so-called incel movement, or involuntary celibate movement, which is a sort of an online subculture of typically quite like nerdy or ostracized men, who then blame the fact that they are not able to have sex with women on some sort of kind of feminist conspiracy to destroy civilization as we know it. And I wanted to ask you to kind of link this, to kind of explain that a bit to us, and then kind of link it to your work on conspiracism. Because on the one hand, these groups do kind of organize in a conspiratorial way, like they kind of organize in the shadows and recruit people and build a kind of anti-feminist, misogynist conspiracy. And on the other hand, both seem to be kind of animated by a kind of conspiracist belief that there is some sort of horrible feminist conspiracy out there that's dedicated to destroying them, their lives, their sexuality, and Western civilization as we know it. And this came maybe to in the recent QAnon documentary from HBO. They kind of draw this line between Gamergate, which drew on both kind of communities, and the siege on the Capitol, where you saw many of the same actors involved, and many of the same actors in the QAnon sort of movement. Anyway, I've just laid a whole bunch of things on the table, but I wondered if you could speak about it.
It's one of those things where, like, again, I often feel like I have different research streams. So this is one I had never thought about together. So I'll try with that, but I'm happy to talk about it on its own and then maybe try to figure out how to connect it to conspiracy. But I think your 2 points are right on, right? Which is, there's a way to think about, I mean, I avoided the language of conspiracism when it came to things like even the alt-right, or but certainly, this kind of PUA to incel pipeline. But yeah, I mean, there's certainly a level of kind of shadowy, secret coordination that happens. I mean, the actions that happen don't happen in public channels. I mean, they are happening in private channels, and in sort of like, encrypted groups at times. And so in that case, then, yeah, I mean, that's a kind of almost like the more kind of, how do I say, like the legalistic version of conspiracy. Like, people get charged with conspiracy, right? It's a legal charge. It's a criminal charge, in the sense of like plotting and organizing in secret to do something criminal. So, and I think, that version of plotting happens a lot, right? I mean, it's just so, and not just in the kind of ways we were talking about, misogynists or the manosphere. But the other part you mentioned too, is, well, let me just pause. Also say, like, the fact that you and I could say that, misogynists might plot in secret, and then and some gamer misogynists did, and Gamergate was born. Like, isn't it interesting that no one would call that a conspiracy theory that we just proposed, right? I mean, it's like, well, we're calling them like plotters and things, but so it's interesting when the term often gets used and when it wouldn't. That I would just kind of put that in the sidebar. But the second part you say about it makes perfect sense. It's like blaming. It's an age-old thing about, like, okay, is basically any enemy construction, that the enemy exists out there and the enemy is coordinated. Is that conspiracism? Is that so I mean, that to me is like, a longer historical question too, to say, like, yes, if you say SJW, social justice warriors, feminists, cultural Marxists, what's the critical race theory, right? All those things that the right wing will kind of chain of enemies that they say, that enemy, those enemies are undermining and destroying Western civilization. That's certainly a kind of, almost like clinical, you might say, paranoid fantasy, but it's very much a political, conspiratorial narrative, and so it there's a way that and this is what I was trying to say earlier, maybe, like, there's almost like a paucity of forms and ways that power can be discussed and narrativized, and the platforms for those. And so there's a way that this, the what we find is like conspiratorial versions of it, and then we call them conspiracies, as well. So I think there's so that's what I would say. But then, in that sense, that any modern governance in some ways is conspiratorial, both because it constructs an enemy, but then also has to plot in secret to combat that enemy, right? Just as you mentioned about COINTELPRO, and if you have security services or secret services, security agencies of that sort, intelligence agencies, what you've basically said is like, we're conspiratorial. We have an enemy, and we need a plot to stop that enemy. So I mean, to me, that's almost endemic to the modern state in that way. Then, and the kind of masculine versions of this around these subjects, the PUAs and incels, certainly have that part of them. Although, I think they're not special in that, if that makes sense.
One of the things I really like about this article is you and your co-author point out that like we can't just decontextualize these movements from the broader political economic world in which they exist, and that's a world where neoliberal ideology and a sort of free market ideology has been wedded to hypermasculinity. And I think we saw this especially in the figure of sort of someone like Donald Trump, not to exceptionalize him, but here's a ruthless entrepreneur, someone who presents himself at least as a ruthless, successful entrepreneur who's also basically a pig, in almost every sense of the word, but certainly in terms of his behavior towards women, really a kind of noxious misogynist character. And that, within the mediascape and the political economy of neoliberalism over the last 40 years, sort of being a kind of successful market actor who imposes his will upon the world has been sold as a way in which we're supposed to craft ourselves as men, and in terms of the kind of gendered options for gendered performance. And you point out in that article, as in the previous article we were discussing too, that like the whole thing feels like it's falling apart. People are trying to inhabit this form of sort of competitive market-oriented masculinity, and yet their lives are often falling apart. They're not able to succeed. They're not being given what they were promised. And then this is in some way the context in which the pickup artist movement or the incel movement sort of gains steam, that rather than saying maybe there's something wrong with the kind of masculinity we've been sold, these movements come to blame it on feminists, social justice warriors, et cetera, et cetera. I wondered if you could speak a little bit more about it in the context of what you call like networked misogyny as well.
Yeah, thanks. That's great. So I will say that, to start with the end, that the term network misogyny is actually Sarah's, my co-author. She'd co-written a shorter piece with I think it was Kate Miltner, but I'm not sure. I think called Network Misogyny. So she really kind of imported that in. But I'll just say a little bit about how I think that was already framed, and then how we kind of resituated it in the work, which was, it was a moment where people also added network to a lot of things, just to kind of figure out the ways that media platforms and technologically enabled action was changing the shape of various things we took for granted, right? So like other people have called it mediated misogyny, online misogyny, but they're basically that, how phenomena are changing based on sort of platformization and different kind of circulation technologies. For her, network misogyny also was tied to what she called popular misogyny, and that was basically a kind of backlash. It was kind of an update to the kind of backlash logic. So what you had arise in the 90s and 21st century especially is what she calls popular feminism, and that's more or less like commodified feminism, very visible, but also very neoliberal, very safe. But at the same time, then that has a backlash of popular misogyny. So what we try to do then is to think about network misogyny specifically in the context of what you just brought up, with this idea of crisis and failure, that so many of our kind of the research in media studies and cultural studies, when they talked about neoliberalism and say reality TV or other kinds of pop culture, it would be about all of these kind of exhortations and ideological mechanisms to keep people going, to be entrepreneurs, to just be self-starters, to just do it yourself. And but what we were also finding at some point is that they're not always successful, and we didn't see so much writing about what happens when how subjects react to those failures. And some people have been writing more recently about young girls and women and how they deal with the pressures to perform perfection and the failures around that. But we wanted to tie it to masculinity and look at that, because there had been at that point not that much written about it in terms of specifically, again, we're in media studies, right? So we want to look at this, the pickup artist phenomenon, the manosphere that it sort of grew out of and really helped shape, but also this reality show that was sort of at the pinnacle of what we would think of as like neoliberal reality TV. And then to see how, the failure in that doesn't get accounted for. And so what we talk about in that piece is that neoliberalism fails to take care of its failures, basically, right? That actually exacerbates its own crisis, because it just tells people to fail better, just keep trying, right? More red pill, just keep working out. But at some point, that Yeah, people reach a kind of limit with that, and with misogyny, or with the pickup artist, what we saw is like that failure means these guys can just revert to fairly available resources, which is I'm entitled to women, and they have rejected me, and now I will seek revenge, and I'm victimized, right? So it's like when neoliberalism fails, there's still this more kind of older, more pervasive patriarchal norms sitting there also waiting for them. So we talk about that in terms of the about failures, but then also that it's predicated on the idea of success also. So meaning like the misogyny is not just when it fails, it's also the idea that if you become a successful entrepreneur, you're entitled to the women of your choice, right? And so partly, also I'll just do a quick thing because I know sometimes the incel term could be a little muddied. What we try to highlight is it's not men who feel just unloved or can't get a date. They can't have access to the women they particularly want, so they get rejected. And so it's different from, I think, the broader context and earlier ideas of involuntary celibacy, because some of these folks say like, well, we can't have the women that we want. It's not just all women, because their idea of what kind of woman is desirable is already limited. So I would, yeah. So anyway, maybe I'll pause there. I might have some more things to say, but if you want to follow up.
Sure. I have another question to follow up on that, but I want to get a question from the audience here. Magda asks if you've seen examples of individuals flipping sides, or individuals or small groups going from sort of conspiracism of the far right to a kind of conspiracism of the radical left. Sort of, we imagine that people transform their consciousnesses by kind of like moving through the familiar political spectrum, but is that the way it actually works? I mean, is that the path that people tend to travel, or do you see other?
You know, it's interesting. I mean, I mean, the thing that comes to mind is not even necessarily about conspiracy theories, but it is about that kind of whole post '60s turn that a number of 60s leftists who became neocons and right wingers. But I mean, again, it to me it was almost like, I mean, yes, maybe what links them is like a certain kind of construction of the enemy. I mean, I'd have to think more, have to give it more thought to think about specific examples. But the way that, so I haven't quite seen it go the other direction. But the only other thing I would say is, I mean, there have been kind of, almost like deprogramming confessionals on YouTube from people who were recruited into the alt-right or into neo-Nazis who then talk about how they got recruited and just how their whole experiential moment with encountering this kind of, whether it's conspiratorial or not, or just fascist, right? I mean, stuff, and then how they were able to come out of it. So I'm not sure if that leads them then to, another kind of conspiratorial mindset. But I'm not sure if that's what you were asking. But I haven't seen exactly, I think, what you're asking for, but asking about. But maybe it's out there.
One of the ways that these far-right formations in the last 10, 15 years have been so successful is that they've been very good at entering into gamer culture, and also in some ways gamifying their own recruitment in curious ways. And I think this was famously sort of emblematized in some of the work that's been done on Gamergate, where there was this kind of outsized, I use the word advisedly, like a kind of hysterical, mostly male reaction to criticisms of video games by video game fans that then escalated quickly into a kind of an online game of vicious harassment against feminist game critics and anyone who kind of got in the way of this kind of mob. And I wonder if you had thoughts on that, and the particular, I mean, maybe to go back also to the work that you were doing on the kind of cosplay war, the war of cosplay, about how games and play into these kind of new formations.
Yeah. I mean, I've just really kind of delving into a little bit of that myself, especially with QAnon. But I'll start by saying, I think, there's depending on how broadly we talk about games, I mean, there's been a kind of game dimension, at least the kind of whodunit or mystery version of the game when it came to even like fairly classic conspiracy research, like who shot JFK, right? It was collaborative, or who brought crack to the U.S. Do aliens exist, right? There's a way that people gather together, and there was, kind of a competition among some of them. Like, I found this, the kind of like, but it didn't really have a kind of design element necessarily built into it. I mean, this was a kind of decentralized network of researchers around the U.S. and around the world when it came to the JFK thing, right, for instance, or later with 9/11 truth. So I think there's been some version, if we consider like the whodunit, a kind of game, certainly a level of investment and pleasure in it. This is where I kind of part ways with some of the other conspiracy theory scholars from my era, from back in the day, whose work I really admire a lot. Otherwise, so people like Mark Fenster and Jody Dean, who really wanted to look at the using Slavoj Žižek's work on enjoyment, the kind of pleasure in conspiracy theories. But they did it in such a way, I mean, the psychoanalytic model is the pleasure is always a kind of the pleasure in failure, right? You never can find the truth, so it just keeps you going. And so I found that to be, I mean, it's sociologically interesting and psychologically interesting, but I'm not sure what to do with that kind of politically. Anyway, so I would say that people have talked about kind of pleasurable investments and affective investments in conspiracy theorizing in different ways. But I think what you're getting at with this other work, like the cosplay, Wars of Restoration, the alt-right, I mean, it has been, it's defining affects in addition to kind of hatred and fear, have been irony and fun, and play in that sense. I do think we can talk about more about game mechanics and design too, but I'll start with the kind of affective side of this and play and the kind of camaraderie that emerges. You mentioned even with things like Gamergate, or that comes out of a certain sense of gaming, of kind of team-based, squad-based play. And the ways that it's interesting sometimes, like even Gamergaters and coordinated misogynists will say like, well, it's not about our targets. We don't really hate women. We're really just having a good time ourselves, really bonding together. I mean, I would question that about the forms of bonding and how one bonds over, an othered person, usually a woman in this case. But there is this sense of like fun built into it, in addition to a kind of mystery, and that comes more with QAnon, this kind of like the ways that whether it's the playful reenactments of these sort of alt-right street protests that are dressing up in the ruins of, these are all dead empires that they fetishize, right? And so the Romans, the Nazis, the Spartans, it's just like these ruined empires. So there's a version of a kind of play in that, but then also I think more probably salient for this institute and for the kind of work that people are doing is this idea of the kind of creation of a set of almost alternate realities with their own kinds of rules, the rules of truth-telling, the rules of performativity, the ways that people find each other, what the goals are, how they set up their values in it. It's participatory. So, I mean, I can go on about QAnon, we will, but even like, game designers have written pieces about how they think QAnon operates like a game, and this is how they would have done it if they were designing something like this. So I think that one in particular, I think is really fruitful, because then we need to ask ourselves, like, okay, well, are there designers? This is going to be my conspiratorial moment. Like, who are the designers for QAnon, actually? Or are we going to believe that it was completely bottom-up, decentralized, and now it's just a series of kind of connected grifters and preachers and influencers? But sometimes when you dig into it, you're like, okay, well, actually, in that HBO documentary too, I'm gonna stop soon, but the HBO documentary, you hear that like, oh, there were these like military intelligence guys who are also really interested in this, and whether or not they were involved is hard to say, because that would take some more investigative reporting. But this idea that if it's a game, if it's an alternate reality, or live action role play, then who's setting up the rules? Who's designing this game? I think is really important to ask.
Yeah, who is the dungeon master and what dungeon are we in?
Yeah, exactly.
And is there a winning to it also?
Right.
Yeah. So I mean, I wanted to ask you too, like you're also someone who studies left-wing movements and movements for liberation, for autonomy, for dignity and human rights. Do you see any of the same, I wouldn't say the same tendencies, but anything that kind of rhymes about the way that more left-wing movements that probably you and I are sympathetic to are organizing today as well? Or is it that the kind of logics that we're talking about of the right don't translate at all to projects of liberation?
That's a really profound question, and it makes me think. I can point to some things, but I think that's where the movements and the struggles also begin to form things, and we have to almost pay attention. We have to listen and see. But I think that it's possible, because I think the kind of affects, the right-wing affects are, and I'm finishing a book right now on microfascism, and it deals with some of this about the kind of death orientation or the necro-political version of this fun. It's a kind of gleeful nihilism, right? That it's the way that and on the right, and we might need some better language around the kind of different kinds of affects, and different combinations that we're seeing. The narcissistic, psychopathic ones, right, that will burn everything to the ground and take everybody with them because they either are indifferent to the world or because they've lost a modicum of power. They want to see it all burn. But then to think about what other kinds of abolitionist joys, because theirs is a version of abolition. That necropolitical version of abolition wants to destroy things, but not in the way that I would say, folks on the left are thinking about abolition in the ways that there's a way for a dismantling that can happen with a kind of conviviality, but also a set of support networks, right? It's not just fun. It's also actually the serious work of the everyday maintenance and the social reproduction of those struggles, which I know, Max, you've had, I cite your interview with Sylvia Federici on this too, right? It's so important, right? This idea that it's a whole range of affects. So I will say that, one of the obviously in the States and elsewhere, the kind of ways that we saw forms of conviviality and joy on the streets during May, June 2020, and the forms of support that people were finding in various cop-free zones, but also during different kinds of insurgent moments, very important around George Floyd and Black Lives Matter. But also I'll point to, one of the things I was just starting to talk about in some presentations in March of 2020 was the kind of resurgence of a kind of global feminist protest, really, in the kind of the rapist in your path protests, mostly emerging from Latin America, which were based on gesture and song and dance, but also serious, articulations of where power was, and but also a kind of collective support, or the Ni Una Menos movements that are still happening. But to find in those, and this is where I would turn to, you can read theoretically the work of Veronica Gago on this, but I would say that there were, and I'm hoping that that's happening too, because that was a moment, and that got cut short very quickly by the pandemic, when then 2 months later, street protests were actually these anti-lockdown protests in the U.S., right? And then and then we had the George Floyd, Black Lives Matter. So there are moments we can, I think, begin to look at the kind of power, the collective powers and collective joys, but but we have to pay attention, I think, with a more refined set of affective or language about affects.
Jack, this has been a really great conversation. I've learned a lot from it, and it's been a really pivotal contribution to our conversations. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks a lot.